This is the Mixed Martial Arts Beat for the third week of October 2014. Hello again, everyone. I'm Ariel Helwani inside our New York City studio. Thank you so much for joining us, and a special thanks to those who are joining us 1 hour earlier than usual. It's 12 o'clock here in New York City. We usually do the show at 1 o'clock, but because of some Apple conference, I don't know, a small thing going on out west, we're doing this an hour earlier. We appreciate your time as always. All right, how about this panel? Joining us from the Sirius XM Fight Club and MMAfighting.com, that is Luke Thomas. The returning Jack Encarnacio of SureDog.com and the Boston Herald, the much anticipated return of Jack to the show. Thank you so much for coming back, Jack. And of course, the man with the hat is here, Chuck Mindenhall of MMAfighting.com. All right, guys, lots to discuss as always. Let's talk about the bantamweight division. We spoke about the 135ers last week on the show, but just late last night, a bunch of news coming out about this division. Interesting news. First, we find out that Uriah Faber is fighting on the stacked UFC 181 card. This card is very interesting. And he'll be fighting Francisco Rivera, who is not in the top 10, who's coming off a loss. And then just a few minutes later, we find out that Renan Barão is coming back on December 20th, just a couple weeks later, and he'll be fighting Mitch Gagnon. And I find these announcements to be interesting for several reasons. Let's start with Renan Barão. I said on this show last week that I feel like he needs to take a lot of time off, that he should probably not come back until February, March because of all the trauma, the loss, everything that went on at UFC 177. Are you surprised that he's coming back this soon?
I guess I'm not. I'm kind of curious as to why you thought he wouldn't take time off because of the damage that the weight cut did. So
he got beat up very badly in May, came back, and afterwards they said it was maybe a little too soon for him. Didn't make weight at UFC 177. They claimed that he hit his head, that he went through all kinds of trauma, did not look like he was in good shape when he did that interview with Joe Rogan. And that wasn't all that long ago. I mean, that was just, what, a month and a half or so ago? This fight's in 2 months. Is that enough time for a guy to really regroup after such a big loss like that just back in May?
I mean, there's lots of things about prize fighting that are medically inadvisable, but he's a young man in his 20s, and young men in their 20s do incredibly stupid and risky things. That's one part of it. I think.
I hope there are people around him, though, that are advising him.
Maybe so, but I think he also is probably very bull-headed about it. I think he needs money. Remember, he didn't get paid a dime, as we were told about that. That's probably an overarching concern. And moreover, this fight is going to be in Brazil. I think there's something about, okay, if I can just be on home soil and have people close to me that I need to make this effort work in the way that it should, keep the wheels greased and the machine running as it can, that's easier to do on home soil than it is maybe traveling to Las Vegas, getting on a plane and so forth. And I mean, again, there's probably some travel that's involved no matter what. Brazil's a huge country, but it's a much more manageable affair. And also, it's an opponent that he can probably beat relatively easy. Not that he can miss weight necessarily. So I think there's a lot of factors. Also, UFC probably needed him. Look at that card. Nubs. Until now. Now it's good. Now it's
fan of Machida Dalloway.
No, that's a fine fight. And then now you have Renan Barão in there. But if you took away, like before last night, the announcement was made, you're like, wow, this card is quite thin. Now it's got a little more oomph to it. It's an opponent he can beat. He can look good in Brazil. They can leapfrog him right to the front. There's a lot of reasons individually that are not huge, but collectively sort of round you around the corner.
And realistically, isn't it, he fought in May. This is in December. That's a 7-month window. I mean, that's still a sizable amount of time.
But he probably thinks this time he can avoid almost becoming 200 pounds in between fights. If he's a little more careful with his diet, the weight cut shouldn't be another huge journey and another potential, horrible crash.
So you think I'm overreacting here?
Well, I think your concerns are well placed, but I'm. Are you guys surprised he came back so soon? I really am not.
I feel like that's actually I thought, he might be coming back sooner even, actually. I thought they might actually try to
schedule that. You're just ignoring what happened in August.
No, not at all. I'm not ignoring it. I'm just saying, like,
he's ignoring it.
He's ignoring it. Yeah.
But also, like, two things. One, the trainers are always leaving the station at Zuffa. There's always cards to be on. And they probably called him and asked him, hey, we kind of need you on this card. And he was like, you know what? Here's an opportunity to redeem myself. And I can beat this guy, blah, 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 blah.
I guarantee, too, that the travel and the being in Brazil and all that played a huge role into it, because it sounds, when these guys come over all the way into the United States, there's so much travel, the toxic airplane water that Nick Diaz likes to. I mean, but seriously, it's like it's harder for people to make that track than to just stay in the backyard. I feel like that was, to me, when I saw it was, it was going to be the Brazilian card, it made sense to me.
But the real surprise isn't the turnaround time, it's Mitch Gagnon.
Yeah.
It's Renan Barão, former champion, one loss off that, a kind of a hugely deflating to his public image issue with weight cutting last time. But it's not like he suffered, another loss that puts him down in Gagnon's stratosphere. So that's perhaps evidence of them taking it not easy on him in terms of putting him right back into the mix. Dominic Cruz is back emphatically, and it's all about him fighting Dillashaw and whether they can put Faber and Cruz again together. And that's what bantamweight's about. And Barao is odd man out in terms of just what's money right now at bantamweight. Him fighting for the championship over Rafael Sunsao would be a bigger deal, but I think right now it's all about alpha male and Cruz and the iterations of that.
And one quite final point, just to piggyback on that a little bit. Listen, I don't know that Barao's ever going to be a major star here. They pushed him as the guy who had this 9-year win streak, but maybe he can be something a little bit more in Brazil. And if you give him a guy like Mitch Gagnon, he can gather some momentum and be, again, I don't think he'll ever be a Anderson Silva or something, but he can be a sizable entity for that market that they can rely on.
Jack, you used the term odd man out.
Yeah.
Doesn't Rafael Sunsao feel like the odd man out? You make 2 big fights at 135. This guy beat the champion. He's won 7 in a row, and yet he's not a part of them.
Right.
Weird, right?
Yeah, it's weird. He just doesn't have any charisma. You know,
I love the way you said that.
Jim?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that's why.
What do you mean?
I mean, you saw his attempt at the post-fight call-out after the Caraway fight. I mean, it's just like you do a face palm. He's trying to get a reaction on that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. He tried, and he's a fantastic fighter, and he deserves a title shot. But Faber and Cruz jump off the page more at this particular point in time, especially Cruz. You know, I mean, that's where the energy is, and that's always how Zuffa has booked their title fights. They need title fights to carry pay-per-views. We're at a point now where, you know, the lower weight title fights can't just be supporting cast for a bigger main event on pay-per-view. They're called upon due to the volume of shows, as we saw with the Dillashaw situation. They have to be main events, and so you've got to put people who draw and have public awareness in those positions. Rafael Sunsao couldn't be further from that. I struggle to think of a scenario in which his fight could be anything but a co-main event if he does get that crack. And right now they need main events, not co-main events.
So why not do Faber a Sunsao? You give Faber this fight against a guy who's not in the top 10, coming off a loss, which is rare. Faber's in this weird spot, right? I mean, Faber is I mean, it feels like he's been in this spot for like the last few years. He keeps winning these non-title fights, and now they're giving him fights which really don't make any sense for him. But to me, Faber Sunsao made all the sense in the world. He beat him once. You could play that up. They're both around there in the top.
Their first fight was exceptionally good.
Exceptionally good, and it was at 145, so you can play that up that it's a new weight class. And
not to mention the right scenario happened. You know, Faber got the win. This would be a Sunsao now who's maybe placed above him. You need to leapfrog him. It's like you think that both guys would sort of want that fight for their own specific reasons, but it seemed like neither one of them were really that into the fight, which was surprising. Especially, I thought, for a Sunsao in a little way. You know, I could a little bit for Faber's side of things. I was like, you know, he's beat everybody in the, you know, under the guys at the top. He's the penultimate fighter. We've been talking about that for a long time. But you know, a guy like a Sunsao who's sort of in this limbo. He sort of ceded his spot to Dominic Cruz. He was sort of like, that's no problem. I thought he might be talked into that fight because it made so much sense. And like we talked about last week, it seems like one of those fights, if you lose one of those guys, that's okay. I feel like that's okay. I know what you're saying about the Faber thing, but he has had so many title fights already. It's already logged. So if he loses to a Sunsao, at least you have Sunsao beating Faber going into that spot, and Faber doesn't get that spot. If he wins, then he's right back into that scenario.
Yeah, it's a great fight. It should happen, and I don't know what discussions did or didn't go on about Faber versus a Sunsao. It serves the UFC's purposes nicely in that if a Sunsao wins, he gets a win over a profile guy that starts to get people to consider him as a bantamweight worth really caring about and paying attention to. Faber is, no matter how many times he loses or how many times he wins, frankly, he's a star at 135, and he's one of the few guys that has shown an ability to move numbers. Maybe not in great amounts, but some of those WC ratings, he's still the steam of that, and he's still a guy they can turn to when the lower weight classes get thin in terms of marquee guys that can move a main event. Sunsao versus Faber strikes me as more of a cable main event, like a TV, Fox Sports 1 main event, or maybe even a Big Fox main event. And right now, they need pay-per-view main events, so that might be part of the reason that fight didn't happen now. I also feel like they're going to be very protective of getting Faber and Cruz together in the cage. Everyone talks about Cruz getting the title shot after the way he blew out Mitsugaki, and that makes a ton of sense. But I also wouldn't be surprised if they're trying to line up Faber versus Cruz, get this issue settled, and get Dominic Cruz the kind of win based on all the equity they already have in building that thing with the Ultimate Fighter show. It's just it's a money match waiting to happen. Not many of those at 135 do that, and then Cruz's title fight might actually draw.
And also things to consider, to your point. Uriah Faber in his last fight, it was some scandal, quote unquote, about him being in the headlining role on Fox Sports for UFC 175. Now that was a great card with a heavy headliner, but if you go back and look at those ratings, they had popped over 1 million for the prelim card. That's very, very good. You know, he has, as to your point, a demonstrated ability crossing television platforms to draw eyeballs. So I think that's one thing to consider. But for Rivera, to me, it's not actually that surprising. And if you notice what Faber said, listen, the UFC is not asking me to fight Sunsao. Like, there's some general meritocratic sense among journalism. journalists, but no one's really asking me. And Rivera's an interesting guy because if Assunção's a very difficult guy to beat, and if you beat him, you have this sort of thing about from the casual fans' perspective, well, Faber's winning. I think that's really all fans care about. Is Faber on a win streak? Is he on a hot streak? Does he have 3 or 4 in a row? Rivera is a guy who has a limited ability, but he can thump. He can crack very hard for that division. It makes it kind of an interesting fight for him, and if he looks good doing it, he gets basically all the same things to promote himself for a future title opportunity without half the danger. That to me seems like a much more understandable course for him, and I can see why he would take it.
We can argue about this all day long. I think the good news is 135 is really interesting these days. You know, for a while it felt very boring with Barão as champion, not because of him necessarily, although
you guys are throwing Brazilians under the bus today, man.
He didn't do a great job of promoting himself. He didn't speak English, but with Dillashaw winning and then winning again, beating the great Joe Soto, of course, and now Dominic coming back and
Joe Soto wasn't Brazilian, is he? He went under the
no,
bus.
no.
Okay.
I didn't throw him under the bus.
I was asking for opinion.
It's just a very interesting time for the bantamweights. Also, by the way, worth mentioning again, 181 is pretty damn awesome, right?
Yeah, it's not bad.
2 title fights. Brown
fight
versus
poster,
Schaub. Yes, the
Just hope,
DC Comics.
stays in the.
I know. It feels like
it's in right now.
178. Like that's the one. Before the end of the year, that's the card to look out for. Also, Holly Holm's debut.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some interesting stories.
Pettis Melendez?
Yeah, the 2 title fights.
Right.
I mentioned that.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, I didn't specifically
I was
mention
tuning you out. I'm
the 4 fighters involved. All right, so we'll put the bantamweights to bed. Let's go back a couple days. Let's talk about Anderson Silva. He does this press conference in Brazil. Very interesting on many levels. First, the presentation. Everyone's sitting on these chairs. And his demeanor was different, in my opinion. I mean, he was a lot more open. He wasn't joking around. He wasn't talking about fighting his clone and things of that nature. I mean, it felt like this
He
was...
did mention his clone once.
Well, okay, fine, just once. But my point was, he was giving us honest answers, at least, talking about coming back home to his family. He never really did that with the media. Maybe he's more comfortable in the Brazilian media, who knows. But to me, it was very interesting to hear him in that light, and also interesting to hear him say that he's not doing any media. Between now...
Maybe that's why he was so open.
Yeah,
this can be my one-off.
Which I don't believe, by the way. But what did you make of this Anderson that we saw? Because, look, he does media all the time in Brazil. It seems like he pops up on these shows. But he doesn't do it like that. And the UFC doesn't do it like that often. Just showcasing one guy 3 months out before a fight. What did you make of it?
I think that you see this quite frequently with athletes, that they get into this routine in their professional career, and this crosses all sort of sports, but you see it in fight sports too, as they are in camps and out of camps and doing media and out of press conferences and so forth, and they adopt a certain demeanor, and you get sort of accustomed to them in certain ways. Also recognize that most of the media done with these guys is when they're cutting weight or after these hugely emotional experiences. He's had a long time, frankly, to unplug and reconnect with his family and sort of, I think in some ways, be in touch with his own fragility and mortality in ways that, mortality might be a strong word, but you know what I mean? Like be in touch with his own things about his life he probably never considered before. And maybe, I don't think it's made him quote unquote soft, but these difficult experiences, and that's, I mean, breaking your leg in that kind of way, it does put you in touch with different parts of your outside life and in your inner life as well. And I think that you saw that reflected in some of his answers. Again, a lot of it was also staged, and the way that MMA is. We talk off the air, it was the most boxing press conference I've ever seen the UFC do. Just one guy with all of his handlers.
Right.
But I do think that what you're seeing is a different Anderson Silva. I don't know, but the turn of the screw in a man's life happens at different intervals, and a big tragic thing like that he's coming back from. It really sort of forces you to take a long look in the mirror about who you are and where you want to go and what kind of things you want to say.
It wouldn't surprise me, too, if part of the thinking here, whenever a fighter who seems untouchable suffers a defeat or suffers a close call, they go back to camp and they say, what can we change about the next camp that won't place the same stressors on the athlete? And I'm sure in some iteration of the reasons they came up with of why Anderson Silva came up flat against Chris Weidman, both fights, allowing for the leg break. Before that, he was having a very difficult time with Weidman, is look, he's all over the place, he's doing too much media, he's constantly in demand, especially in Brazil. I mean, it sounds like the weight he has to carry in Brazil is substantial. It's not US-based mixed martial arts websites putting in requests for this guy. It's like he's a Brazilian celebrity, and that's a higher kind of level of requests for your attention and time that I think we actually can appreciate on the state side of things as far as where he stands in that culture. I mean, he flies the flag of mixed martial arts for the whole country, and everything he does is of interest, it seems, to the general Brazilian sports public. So they sit down and they say, how can we change things about this camp such that Anderson isn't under the same duress? All right, we got to cut out media. We won't do any media. A lot of fighters do that. George St. Pierre started to do that when he had performances that, certainly he would win, but he'd start to lose a little bit of steam. It'd start to get to him mentally. We saw that play out really dramatically in the primetime show before the Hendricks fight, where his eyes are darting all over the place, and he's obviously under tremendous duress, and he talks about the psychological stress afterwards as a part of the reason. And so one of the easiest things if you're a camp to do is just say, we don't need these media people. We don't need to be taking 2 hours out of every day when he needs to be training and get healthy to accommodate the media.
That's the difference I saw. I saw a guy who did not have the stress or the pressure on him in this particular circumstance. I don't know how much you paid attention to sort of his second half of his run as he was sort of defending the belt. There was so much added pressure. There were strange people within his entourage. His entourage would get so big, and new people, like strange celebrities, would be showing up. It was like it was taking on a life of its own. Usher, and it's a great example.
And major Brazilian, to your point, major Brazilian soccer celebrities.
Absolutely. Like there was so much strangeness and pressure to keep going and to keep doing that we were contemplating all the time. How much longer does he go? Is he going to retire? Are we looking at the last Anderson Silva fight? I remember having those discussions a lot. How many more does it go? 2 more fights? Now we're sitting here, he comes back, he doesn't have a belt, he's got a rod in his leg, he's talking about fulfilling all 7 fights on his contract, and it's just a bizarre sort of 180. Now, does he really do that? Probably not. I don't think he will actually uphold all of that, but he's talking, it's like the escalation of all that pressure sort of went away, and it's like they're sort of managing. I agree with you guys 100%. It's like, I feel like they're trying to manage it, and he's letting that ease. He's easing back into the game the way he wants to, and I felt like you're sort of seeing him lighter and more carefree in the fight game, which he was enigmatic for a long time because he was sort of, I felt like he was psychologically sliding, through certain fights leading up to Chris Weidman 2. I felt like that was there, even the first one, when he was hitting him in the, with the Chael Sonnen stuff, all that Chael Sonnen stuff and everything else. I mean, you just go back and you sort of look at that course. I always felt like he was fragile. Something about the fight game, there was fragility in play that he was holding off from cracking or something under the pressure. I felt like all that had went away.
You can see it in the walkout for the Weidman rematch. Total different demeanor, total different routine, drops to his knees, seems horrified. And he talked at the press conference that he did in Brazil about the shakiness of the legs. You feel like you want to walk backwards as you come to the ring because that's the brevity of the moment. And never had I seen Anderson look more in his own head than that Weidman rematch walkout. And everyone talked afterwards of how it seemed prophetic. Like he knew he's going to the gallows and he's about to suffer a horrific injury. It seemed like it all matched like a narrative. I saw a very different Anderson Silva walking out for the rematch. I don't like to read too much into that, but you don't really get a more honest look at who a fighter is than when they're walking to the cage about to fight for their life.
After the first loss to Weidman, he said, "I'm good with not being champion. There's a new king. That's all. That's all in the past now." And then just a few days later, he says, I back, and let's go for the belt again. Then
that would be normal.
Right, yes. Then he breaks his leg, takes some time off, and is very reflective and emotional. But it seems like the belt is no longer his mission. He doesn't need to be champion anymore. That's changed as of late. He's saying, I want to be champion. I would love another crack at Chris Weidman. Is that even plausible at this point? Like, do you think that they can actually sell a third fight against Chris Weidman after what happened the first 2 times? Is there enough doubt there because of how both fights ended? I was talking to someone yesterday and they're like, yeah, I'd love to see that fight. Just a random fan. Yeah, the first time he was cocky, the second time he broke his leg. Those were flukes. Do you think it's actual
2-time fluke?
Yeah, it actually makes sense to do that?
Support for major stars in fight sports dies very hard. Very hard. It is a slow, twisting, painful death that fans let go of their belief in a fighter. It took a long time for people to finally let go of what happened to BJ Penn. He had to basically look lifeless against a guy who had, I thought BJ won the first one, but technically had lost to him twice, and they're like, okay, Frankie's the better fighter. Frankie had been the better fighter for years,
right.
And they finally came around to it. It takes a long time to let go of that. Even people who weren't nearly as good but had name power, people like Kimbo Slice, there's still kind of interest in Kimbo Slice, and they recognize he's a guy of limited ability. And I think certainly if Anderson Silva can go out there and beat Nick Diaz in a way that is both entertaining and compelling, and at least has a degree of sellability for the future, I absolutely think they're going to rocket ship him right to the front of the queue, even though there might might be Jacare in the wings, and we'll see what happens with Bisping and Rockhold. I just feel like you got a guy who you can put in title fights, who people would still want to see in title fights, who even if irrationally believe he lost those 2 fights with Weidman for reasons that have nothing to do with their own ability. It doesn't matter. They love this guy. They want to believe in this guy. Give them a reason to hope. And if he can do that against Nick Diaz, that is exactly what's going to happen.
I think the factor of whether you think someone can win or lose is often overplayed as a real reason people want to see fights happen. If you think if you aren't sure who's going to win, that helps add to the intrigue of the match, but it isn't the real thing that brings people to the table. The question is, are you invested in either of the fighters' stories? Is a win just as interesting to see play out as a loss? Do you want to be there if Anderson loses to Chris Weidman again, or if he wins against Chris Weidman? The answer to both questions is yes, because he's a star, because through his tenure and through his fighting ability, he's managed to get into our minds and earn a place there as someone we care about as a fighter, because he's amazing. And so I think that's just as big a factor as whether someone thinks a guy has a shot to win or lose. That's icing on the cake. That's what puts the draw of the match over the top. He also could lose. But it starts with, is it a fighter I care about? And the UFC, can't afford to not play that card as enthusiastically as they can, right now. Anderson Silva is going to get thrust into that title shot again soon, and people will sign on because people are interested in what Anderson Silva is doing, and I don't think that they consider him breaking his leg on a kick as a sign of his real true decline.
It's funny, when you talked to Chris Weidman a couple weeks back on MMA Hour, I remember you were asking him something along the lines of, would you entertain, or do you think that this could happen again? And he was the first guy that I heard talk about it that I was like, this could actually happen. It's strange because it doesn't seem like an obvious thing. He's lost twice, even though he had that reign beforehand. He's probably not going to get a third fight anytime soon. It doesn't happen that often in fighting, where that not in the UFC. But he sort of seemed open, like I could see that happen. I could see a scenario where that might happen. So once he sort of talked that way, I was like, all it really takes is Anderson to show up, look good, knock out, look like himself, beat Nick Diaz in such a way. Maybe he fights the Rockhold Bisping winner. Maybe that's the fight that happened. If he puts together a couple fights like that, he beats that guy, he's right back there.
One of the bullets in Mike Goldberg's chamber right now is Anderson is back. And as soon as he fires that shot, everyone buys in, everybody agrees. You ready for that?
Oh, no, I am not.
Okay.
It's like two Lukes today.
Let's look at boxing as an analogy. You have Pacquiao and Marquez. They have fought 4 times.
Yep.
Now, it's a bit of a different scenario in that you have 2 national heroes, and what is the continuity there was a series of disputed decisions, but also great fights between 2 megastars. And I understand your point, and it's the point I believe, that I think Chris Weidman is a superior fighter to Anderson Silva in just about every way at this point. But there was a weird ending to the first one, and there was a weird ending to the second one.
Right.
People can believe, and look what happened in the 4th Marquez-Pacquiao fight. Pacquiao got knocked clean out. People believe that, give a guy enough chances, and if there's uncertainty before, let's finally get that one definitive end. And you sort of think, Pacquiao basically was on top heading into that 4th fight. It was, the first fight was a draw, but you get the idea, like he was the guy who had more success, basically. And then now you feel like, well, who won that war between Pacquiao and Marquez? The wars.
Right.
Well, maybe it's Marquez, and I think Anderson Silva fans will cling to some idea of that.
And
go ahead.
This foreboding sense that he'd be walking into tremendous peril by fighting Chris Weidman again, it reminds me an awful lot of how folks felt about Randy Couture when he went to fight Tim Sylvia after losing so soundly to Chuck Liddell and being knocked out cold for the first time in his life. He jumps up a weight class, he fights Tim Sylvia, who everyone thought was going to ring his bell just like Chuck Liddell did. Everybody wanted to be there to see if he could do it. No one believed he could, but that if he does pull it off, you need to check that fight out. You need to be there if Anderson Silva returns to form.
Yeah, and I felt like the last fight, regardless if it's fair or not, because obviously he hurt himself on an offensive move, it still felt like it was unresolved. There was a feeling in the arena afterwards that it was not fully resolved. So therefore, that sort of feeling still exists. What happens if the thing goes, if that doesn't happen, does Anderson Silva win that? That sort of thing. So I feel like at some point, if all the stars start to align and they're the 2 guys, you could see it happening based on that alone. Like they could play up that angle a little bit. Like, well, not everything went the way that we thought it was going to go. There were some strange endings to these fights, so you could see that we'd hinge on that vibe a little bit.
If he looks dominant in victory against Nick Diaz, do you agree? I mean, I could totally see them putting him in a title fight right away. Forget about another fight. They're going to put, especially if Weidman is still the champion, right?
If
he
Weidman
beats
fights
Belfort.
Jacare first,
You think okay? So you think Weidman has to fight twice?
That seemed to be a very key thing that Anderson Silva wanted to point out time and time again when he spoke this week. Is I don't want to cut in front of what John Gray has worked for, my good friend.
But here's the thing about Weidman, though. Weidman's like one of these Pettis guys where they're so talented, but seemingly cannot stay healthy. Like the Redskins' Jordan Reed, like unbelievable ability. I wonder if that equation will change if after this fight coming up with Belfort, somehow he gets injured in training and they have to delay it, and then the stars align for timing between Silva and Weidman. What will he do then? So to your point, I understand what you're both saying, but I would be that's something I would monitor.
One of the many interesting things he said in that press conference was that he believes that if you fail a drug test, they should consider just cutting you. And this is a guy who knows a thing or two about, drug test failures. He's never failed a test, but he's fought a lot of guys who at some point failed the test. And, there are a lot of people who believe this. Josh Gross, longtime MMA journalist, has often said this, that he believes it should be one and done in the UFC, especially in the UFC, the NFL of mixed martial arts. And these days, I'm kind of starting to feel that the best way to handle this epidemic in this sport, if you want to call it that, is one and done. What do you guys think? Is that too harsh?
I'd agree. It would take a long time to really determine guilt, because if your job was on the line, every fighter is going to appeal. And every fighter is going to try to basically usurp the test such that they couldn't be fired, and they'd have to bring him back like they had to bring Brandon Vera back for losing to a guy who lost a drug test. So it's a longer process to actually determine if someone is guilty of a drug offense than you might think, and that's a difficult proposition. I also think it's a real factor that if a high-level guy fails a test and you set that precedent, you set that absolute rule, and he goes to Bellator, no one's interests are served. And that's, of course they would never acknowledge that as a real factor, but we all know the truth.
I think the reality is you have to ask yourself, what does the MMA community consider to be clean enough? That to me is the issue, because I wrote this big article about what would it be like if the UFC signed on to be a WADA code signatory, which no league has done, but MLB is fairly close in some ways. And the reality is the things they have to do are significant, not just on the testing side, but on the punishment side. I should note that lifetime bans don't even the WADA code says 4 years. It doesn't say a lifetime ban, although multiple offenders, you can change that a little bit. But I just mean, you have to accept the idea that there's this one hardcore standard and then there's absolutely no testing at all. And the reality is, I think the MMA community is okay with a little bit of cheating. If you're mostly making an effort and you're mostly punishing guys and you're mostly making a demonstration of force, if a couple guys sneak through the cracks, I bet you the majority of the fan base will be like, well, okay, you're trying, and the fights I want to see are basically preserved. That, I think, is the general attitude about doping, for good or bad.
Yeah. But should the UFC even pay attention to that? If they are truly interested in cleaning up the sport, what better way to do so than tell everyone that you're going to lose your job if you fail once?
Well, I could be mistaken on this, but I think part of the reason Josh Gross thinks that way is because Dana White said that would be the policy when Chemo failed at the time he fought Ken Shamrock. This was a new wave issue for the UFC as Nevada implemented drug testing in late 01, which was the baseline test, and then in 02, guys started failing for steroids that aren't only illegal to fight with in your system, but
is this the one Josh Barnett failed too?
Yeah, around that same time period. Not only illegal to fight within your system, but illegal to possess Schedule III drugs, to Chael Sonnen's point about what is illegal to the point of the law. And that's why whenever it's like drostanolone, which is illegal to possess, fighters always appeal, because you're kind of breaking the law to have it in the first place, let alone have it in your system, and several other anabolic steroids as opposed to just testosterone or human growth hormone. So all of that said, I think Dana has said before that he'd cut people if they failed drug tests in the haste to be perceived as doing something to stop it. But I think as time goes, it's sort of like it's a difficult proposition, because it's not so much that you'll stop people from using agents, it's that you'll change the pattern of behavior such that they'll be looking to use things that aren't the kind of things that can get the DEA to kick the door down and have you charged with allowing people to use illegal drugs. It happened to Vince McMahon. If your guys are all using things that the federal government says are illegal to possess, eventually that becomes a real problem. But if everyone's doing the things that aren't on that schedule, like testosterone, which is a naturally occurring substance, it's less of an issue and less of a fireable offense. I can see a wrongful termination lawsuit big time if they just fired someone.
Are you basing this off of Anderson Silva saying that? Is this where this is from? Like
yes,
him recently saying this? Because as much as it seems like you could just make a hard cut and say, like, you know what, one strike and you're out.
Right.
You could make that case. If in any sport you're going to do that, it would have to be something like mixed martial arts, where, in baseball, if you're juicing and you're just trying to bash a ball over the fence, you're not hurting anything but the integrity of the sport. If you're doing that, and there's other things in play with safety and health and everything else for what's going on in the cage. We go through this thing all the time, but to me, it's like you can make that hard line, but to me, I'm still like, you're dealing in human beings, and if you're talking about like one-off mistake. People are stupid in general, you know what I mean? Like, people are going to make mistakes, they have to learn from mistakes. People are going to go through and do what they do. To just say, like, you're gone, you know, it's just, it can't stand because people make mistakes, you know what I mean?
Sure.
In youth especially, they make a lot of mistakes. Guys in this sport particularly get older. Those are the ones you're like, you know, they get a little bit, it gets a little strange because the older guys are the ones getting busted or whatever. But you can't see a scenario where a one-off would feel good about saying, like, nope, you're gone. Before a guy, you know,
Right.
You can't, I know a lot of these guys know exactly what they're taking, but there probably are instances, I would say, where guys are being fed something that they don't realize. I think that people have to monitor.
Or if they're injured and they're just like, I got to get through this camp. I got to get through this camp.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, if that was the rule, no fighter would acknowledge use, and that's what we all want. We all kind of give a fighter a break when he sits there and says, I did it. And nobody would ever do that if their job was on the line. Everybody would cast aspersions on the whole process.
Also, what is any sports organization, NBA, UFC, whatever? In NBA, it's an organization that stages high-level professional basketball contests. That's what they do. But they also are charged with growing the sport to some extent internationally. They're also charged with policing their own ranks in terms of performance-enhancing drugs. They have these competing responsibilities and interests. They can't do one such that it negates the whole essence of the mission. Otherwise, why are you in business? Right. You're in business to put on high-level basketball contests. If you have these other things that your responsibilities, quote-unquote, you're required to do that makes this impossible, this will get deteriorated to some extent. So, you know, when you say, is it the UFC's job to clean up the sport? No, it's another organization's job to clean up the sport. You can say they might have some corporate responsibility, and that's a different discussion, but the UFC's job is to stage high-level mixed martial arts contests. That there should be a clean sport, I think everyone would agree to, but they are not going to be the ones independently to do it on their own.
They're there to keep the doors open, you know, to make money on fights and not suffer huge consequences, not just in pay-per-view buys, but you know how mad Las Vegas gets if they expect a huge fight, casinos go out for money, and a fight gets canceled. It's like everyone takes a huge hit. I mean, just the cancellation of the Aldo Mendez fight for August 2nd had a substantial impact on their revenue for this year. It's like, that's a huge risk that you have to fire someone when they fail a test, especially if it's a pre-fight test, and a fight gets canceled, the fight falls through. Those are real considerations. I remember asking one time on my show, I asked Patrick Arnold, who created the Clear. He was in concert with Victor Khan. He said, what would it really take for athletes to not feel like it's worth using PEDs? And he said, no one gets paid.
And they still cheat on the amateur level too.
Right, because they want to get paid.
Right. Well, even the Olympics, like those guys cheat. They cheat.
And there's a lot of money to be made if you achieve a gold,
course, yeah,
silver,
if you get a gold medal,
or bronze.
right.
So
and national pride.
But if there's no money involved, then suddenly people aren't going to the absolute lengths of and testing their own personal health and testing the integrity of the whole enterprise. And that's never going to happen. This is prize fighting. We show up because people are fighting for money, and we pay our money to see it.
You mentioned Chael Sonnen, and I had the honor of being on his podcast.
Look at you plugging it.
The debut episode has nothing to do with me being on it. We'd probably be talking about this. Well, we would be talking about it if he said the same thing, because I thought his demeanor to be very interesting, especially when talking about his PED use. Not remorseful at all, saying I'm not sorry, saying I would do it all over again.
Defiant.
Defiant. Saying I wouldn't aid the investigation, all kinds of things. I definitely suggest listening, especially to that portion of it. What did you make of Chael? And you know, we're so used to, you know, I brought up Andy Pettit and all these other cases, and he didn't want anything to do with that.
I noticed that.
He started snoring at one point, didn't
Right,
he?
exactly.
He did start snoring. Yes, that's funny.
I don't think he knows who Andy Pettit is.
Very good point.
He said he wasn't a sports guy. That's true.
But you know, we're used to a certain way of dealing with these issues.
Yeah.
He's not doing it that way. What do you make of it?
First of all, I recommend listening, because I don't know what's truth and what's fiction, but it's something, and it's a mix of the two. I don't know how you guys feel about it. There's a lot of ways to look at it, but for me, I looked at it kind of interesting in the sense that if you look at his wrestling career, there's a funny story he has with Mark Munoz, wrestling Mark Munoz, and Mark said, I never wrestled a guy so many times that tried so many illegal things in the course of wrestling. Different holds he wasn't supposed to use and different grips. Then Mark still won. Mark was the national champion for Oklahoma State. But it was just sort of caught my attention that this guy's been trying to game the system, however you want to describe it, forever. But it didn't really work in wrestling for a lot of reasons. One, they compete so often. I think two, it's a little more rigid in terms of what you can get away with and what you can't. It is much more heavily tested. A lot of things. It's just he couldn't quite excel excel through the ranks in that way. But MMA is a wide open space. It's very easy to game the system. In the interview with you, he even talked and lauded the abilities of Conor McGregor, not just to win, but how everyone should accept the guy's salesmanship as a legitimate reason for him getting title opportunities. Like, this is part of winning. This is part of the experience. That's not part of the experience in wrestling at all. And I think he said that the impetus was the Okami match and how he felt angry. He was competing in the prelims. But I also feel like he's always had a penchant to find holes in the system and to plug it. And he basically says, I was going to try it. I had my own personal limits, but I'm going to do everything possible along the way to game it. And it took him pretty far. And I think he enjoyed the success of it. He was good at it. And that's why he's unapologetic about it.
That's exactly it. He was. What did he lose by doing these things? Very little. He lost his reputation, but think of how much money he made because he was able to win these fights and outmuscle guys with his double leg takedowns and suddenly be a force in the wrestling department that he never was before he admitted in testimony before the commission he started taking shots of testosterone. The most interesting thing he said with you on that show to me was, here's the problem, it works. Okay? This isn't some phony baloney experimental thing that all these guys do, but if you're a real champion, you don't need that stuff. Look, if this did not work, there wouldn't be speculation about every fighter on the planet engaging in this behavior. The fighters would be the one to not do it if it didn't work. It makes a huge difference to your ability to control guys in the cage, to have greater endurance, to recover faster in camp, which is vital to your earning potential, so you're not falling out of fights all the time. And I was so glad to hear him say that, because it puts so much BS to rest when this issue comes up and people get defensive about how much of a difference it really makes. I get so tired of that argument, because you can list the guys who were on PEDs who lost. Fine, but it makes a difference. That's why fighters do it. It helps you win fights and make more money.
You mentioned his reputation, though. I don't really feel like his reputation has been hurt all that much. I mean, you see the reaction to his podcast coming out. You see the way fans talk about him. I mean, in our little bubble, I don't think people really care. They don't really care.
In MMA, we live in a world.
He was pretty much done. How many more fights did he have really left, right?
Yeah, was he 37, I think?
Yeah.
He didn't have many more. MMA is a world with basically very few consequences. I don't want to bring in Mike Goldberg, poor guy, but I would...
Only a matter of time.
Yeah, well, I would just sort of point out, we live in a world in mixed martial arts where things that you can't not get away with in the sports world, it is certainly not only is it allowed in combat sports, it is encouraged. Yes. It is rewarded. It is funded. It is lauded. It is galvanizing. You look on fan forums, and I was sort of reading the reaction to it, and it was like, the gangster is back. They love the idea of a guy giving an FU to the system and making money off of it, however phony or real the narrative might be.
See, I don't totally agree with anything you guys are saying. I think that it's one of those things.
You're wrong, Sean.
I'm generally wrong, but I feel like here's a guy. You were talking, that interview was fascinating because you're talking about a guy who basically put himself on the map by being bold, by being audacious, by doing the things that sort of put him into a spotlight where he took it under himself. He changed basically mid-career and said, I'm going to be a different person. I'm going to do this stuff. Now, he obviously has charisma and he has all that stuff. He was able to sort of leave his imprint in the fight game in a way that's like, wow, look what this guy did. Now people are emulating what he did. All the things that he did are sort of carried through some hard times there too. He was keeping things on. We were talking about him in fights he had nothing to do with. He would steal shows. That's what he did. He was on top of the world. I feel like this whole thing that happened with him, it's to me, and I see it. I mean, I see it like sort of what you guys are saying. I see that stuff too, but I see a complete opposite backlash of that too. I see like where people are just, they're like, what a joke, and I'm like, here's a guy who was up here. He had it all. Like the company loved him. He had all this stuff, and now he's he's doing a podcast. I'm not saying, whatever, he's going to land on his feet. He's going to do okay. But I think that to think that he didn't damage himself. This is a guy, we talked about this another time too, where I felt like he's one of those guys who, he has it in him to put something together, and he blows it at the most crucial moments. He's one of those guys, absolutely. And I feel like that's what he did. And maybe right now, especially outside of the fight game, as time goes on, he'll just kind of, to me, he's going to fade away. He'll just become more of a distant joke to the situation.
I don't think so at all. I think he's a guy, the story of Faust, I won't get into it, it's a literary story, but basically a guy makes a deal with the devil to get all these things in his life. And at the end, once he gets them all, and he basically has to pay the piper and go to hell, he regrets it all. I think Chael would take Faust's deal 7 days a week and twice on Sunday. You mean I get to taste these things once? Great. I don't care if I have to go to hell. I don't care if I have to do all these things. I will take that deal. Just the fact that he got to do those things and be in those places, even if ephemeral, even if fleeting, he got to do it. He got to be that guy. And I still think that people admire a guy who was willing to just implode, basically, in spectacular fashion. And will he be what he was?
Yeah.
No, he won't be what he was, but he will be something.
That boldness and audacity I was talking about that sort of got him there doesn't look good in this new light, is all I'm saying. Like, for him to not apologize, for him to sort of, like you said, to be defiant, that's what, it just doesn't look the same. It's a different feeling when he's doing it right now. He's in a light where I thought he would be able to look at the big picture, and I was very surprised that he said what he said on that show. I thought he would use that platform to sort of maybe, he's obviously has the ability to double talk and to manipulate a situation. I thought he would at least do that. And I'm not saying he necessarily needed to lie, but it was very off-putting. He can't pull the same tricks he was doing right now, under his new circumstances. That's all I was trying to say.
Chael reads the tea leaves, He knows that what can he say now that's interesting? Not a defense of why he didn't do it, because everybody just says that's ridiculous. What he can say now that's interesting, that'll get him attention, is I don't apologize because I'm not sorry, and I did it because it worked, and I'm not going to fight this. Who says that? Right. And Chael Sonnen takes all that into account before he opens his mouth. There's a lot of rehearsal, I'm sure, that goes on between interviews, in terms of, if this comes up, what am I going to say? Tailoring it with his people who watch, grappler Lynn Denton promos and wrestling on YouTube, as far as how to explain something in a soundbite way that you just kind of get lost in the poetry of the soundbite. You don't even realize whether or not he answered the question. Just the poetry sticks with you. He wrote a book with poems and stuff like that. Sure. So he's a wordsmith. He has fun playing around with words too, and that's just as much fun to him as fighting.
Words mean, though.
and I feel like I fall halfway between you guys in that when he first came under this scrutiny and he first had that first of 2 drug test failures and he didn't lose his job at Fox right away, I thought this man will suffer no recompense. In fact, the only thing he will have done by taking these substances is gain, I don't know how much he's made, let's say millions off the 2 Anderson fights. Right. Do those fights happen if he wasn't as competitive as he was for 4.5 rounds at 117 and the winning streak before that, which all came after he started on the regimen? Dan Henderson saw similar gains after he started doing the same thing. And it's like, he's going to come out in the positive on all this. People might roll their eyes, but they rolled their eyes about him anyway to a certain degree because of his approach. But when he lost his Fox job, to me that was real demonstrable harm. If he comes back in a year after everything blows over and he's back on Fox and chopping it up and making that money, then I'll change my perspective. But that surprised me that he got fired. He lost something real there.
It'd be interesting to see if he's able to do that. That's why I guess I'm at. I'm sort of like, I feel like he's done more damage to himself than I guess you guys believe right now. But we'll see. I could be completely wrong. Next year he could be back in Fox and doing everything he was doing before.
Number 1 sports podcast on iTunes.
Yeah.
Number 1.
Yeah. And
that's actually the Helwani effect.
Yeah, I was going to say. To that point, I was going to say, well done, because what you basically did was still interrogate him on his own show, which I thought was like a neat trick for his first one. I don't know if every one of his podcasts is going to be about Chael Sonnen, people asking Chael Sonnen questions, but that was well done.
I would call it MMA's version of the Colbert bump, but Sonnen reminds me more of Colbert than you do.
Sure. Well, my 2 cents, probably good for him to just get it all out there. He's going to start this new venture on podcast, talk about it, and then he can move on with his life. He's not going to bring it up.
Chris Liebman's stories, though. He wanted to tell you Chris Liebman's story.
I heard the Liebman story afterwards while listening to the show.
First of all, it's a horrible story.
And I've heard it before. I heard it. He said the story, I believe,
it's a story of literal child abuse. Literally child abuse.
I've heard this story before, so I stand by what I said about the Liebman story. I want a Sonnen story. I don't want a Liebman story.
I'm with you. And he has stories, too.
He has tons of stories.
He has stories.
Guys, great stuff. Really enjoyed this week's show. Appreciate it very much. Hope you did as well. We're out of time, but we'll be back next week. Of course, there's a bit of a break, a lull in the schedule this weekend. Not much to talk about. There's a Bellator show, but it's not very good. And then a rare Saturday night off. How about that? Next weekend, of course, is UFC 179. We'll be back here. Same place, but a different time, our usual time, 1 p.m. Eastern, to talk about that and a whole lot more. For Luke, Jack, Chuck, I'm Ariel. Thank you so much for watching. Enjoy your weekend. We will see you next week.